Thank you so much. Thanks, Tim. That's my father-in-law, by the way, so extra special. And my parents are in the back row there, so I have to really perform well tonight. I have to say, when we first started having this conversation about how the work that Chip has done in his book and the things that he thinks about and the work that I do and the things that I think about, in fact, it was Tim's idea that we should merge those two concepts and disciplines, and really found that we had something powerful to say about the least of these and the vulnerable. And in my own work at the Institute for Faith Work and Economics, I've been blessed. I'm an economist by training, but I've been blessed for the past almost 6 years to work with theologians from whom I've learned much, and to really say, for me, I've been a Christian since I can remember, and I've been an economist since graduate school. And I think it's really important to connect those two things. I think that's important for all of us, to never leave our biblical roots as we pursue our vocations and as we pursue our callings. And so in light of the things that Chip just had to say, I want to talk a little bit about, I want to build on the foundation, so there might be a little bit of overlap at the beginning, but I want to talk a lot about something that I think is resurging in the news, both domestically and globally. And it's this idea of what are we after as a society, as a people? What are we, as an economist would say, what are we trying to maximize? Because we're always trying to maximize something. And we can say we want to maximize profit or we want to maximize income. And I think that those are good things to maximize, but I think it's not the whole story. And so I think we have to have a grounding in theology, what Scripture says about who we are, what we're here for, and how do we live amongst each other. In the story, I think the very moving story that was just told, which was personal, and I think that's why it's a really important exercise to not just view this as intellectual. It is intellectual, but it's personal, because we all have stories like this. I'll share mine at the end. And I think what we have to remember is we're always and everywhere talking about our fellow human beings and our responsibilities as Christians toward them. So that's where I want to start. But as an economist, I think hopefully what I bring to the table is an ability to talk about, okay, if these things are true, if we're equal in dignity, if we agree to that, then there's certain implications for the society in which we have to live. And I use that phrase intentionally. There's a wrong way to human flourishing, and there's a right way to human flourishing. And so if we believe that people should be afforded dignity and the opportunities that that entails, then there's a certain type of social, economic, and political order that is required, and as was already mentioned, that we must be vigilant around. And there are places today where we're losing that at different paces and different levels. So I think there are things to be optimistic about in the world, and I think that there's real cause for concerns that the church needs to be at the center of. So that's kind of what I'm going to try to spend some time talking about today. And I think that the way that we start this, I don't know how well you can see this, but in the background there, I have a puzzle. And I have little children. We do a lot of puzzles in our house. They're not this advanced yet. But what's so great about doing a puzzle? I think what's great about doing a puzzle, well, first let me ask, what do you do when you do a puzzle? Just shout it out. What are the things you do when you get that puzzle and you put it on the table? You organize it. What else do you do?
You flip all the tiles over to the colors.
You need all the colors facing up. What else?
Yeah.
You make the edge. Okay, we do all these things, but we're skipping stuff. What do? So you go to Walmart or wherever you go, Amazon, and you get the puzzle. Yeah, right. We look at the picture, we take it out of the box, and what do? We prop that box right up on the windowsill, and we cheat the whole time, right? We know what we're looking for, we know what good looks like, and we do that. If we didn't, puzzles would not be fun, they would be exhausting. Right? It would just be another thing. So they're fun because we know what it's supposed to look like. And I think that's a really important metaphor for modern economics and our place in the world, which is that God as the master creator, we talked about this a little bit already, the master artist, the master architect, knows what good looks like. And in fact, what I want to start with is thinking about what are God's design and desires for his creation? Because that has to be our starting point. If we're going to have a biblical theology of what are we supposed to do economically and politically and socially amongst each other? And I think we have to start with what are God's designs and desires for his creation. So I'm going to kind of orient this talk around these three things. And then what principles in creation inform how we can and should live today. So I think sometimes in Christian teaching, maybe on Sunday morning, we go back to Genesis as an important narrative about the world and how it was created, and I think that's an important story, and it's one we need to understand, but there's something much deeper which Chip already detailed in that story, and I think it's informative for who we are and how we live in the 21st century. So there's a lot in Genesis, and I think that's always the place that we should start to kind of understand our role as human beings, and again, how we're going to relate to each other. And that has to always be connected back to what are God's designs and what is his desire for his creation. And then how does the call to work, how does the notion of purpose, I'm going to make a claim that calls us to a society where we need economic freedom, and that there are other freedoms that are associated with economic freedom, including political freedom and religious freedom. Those things don't act in a vacuum, they act together. But that this type of society is the one in which we can do what we're supposed to do and care for each other. And I like the way Chip put it, not just people who are like us, but everyone. So what kind of society affords us the ability to live into our calling and to make contributions to God's creation? So we already went through this verse, but I think it's really important. And so I'm just going to spend another minute on it. As we've seen already in verse 27, it's repeated multiple times that we're made in the image of God. And Chip is a theologian, I'm not. So I think, we leave it to him to help us understand that nuanced understanding. And I really like the idea that it's the base, it's what comes first, it's universal, it's ubiquitous. Being made in the image of God is why we have dignity, right? And I think it's a humbling thing to think about the fact that God didn't need us, he wanted us. He wanted to love us, he wanted us to do certain things, he wanted to be in relationship with us. That wasn't necessary, it was desired. And so the whole creation story is a reflection of the master architect's, the master creator's desire of what should be, the way things should be. And of course that gets distorted with the fall, which I'll talk about in a minute, but I want to take you to verse 28 here. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." And I highlight the word earth here. There's debates in theological circles about what this means. But I think the fact that the word earth is used and not garden is important. We're to fill the whole earth. Now the theological debate is, does that mean extend the garden to the whole earth, or does that mean leave the garden? I'm not qualified to answer that. But it means everything. Everything. There's no part of God's created order that we don't have a role in. And that's what we are put here for. And so there's big, this was referred to as the creation mandate. There's big responsibility that comes with this in terms of what it means for who we are, and again, how we live amongst each other. I think it's important, and as Chip and I were talking and preparing, coming up to the talk, there was a nuance that fell out to me that was really important that I don't think I had considered before in as much detail as I consider it now. And I think the idea that I want to unpack a little bit is this notion of purpose. Purpose is, I think, part of that base. We all have purpose because we're here. Because if we're here, it's part of God's desire for us to be here, which means we all have a role to fill, a purpose to serve, even if we're not all capable in the same way. So the vulnerable, the discarded, the poor, the weak, they have a purpose. And I think it gets very easy, especially, and these are kind of the trappings of wealth, maybe. I think it gets very easy in the 21st century, especially in Loudoun County, where I'm trying to raise young, grounded Christian children, right? The race is already at a very early age, be the smartest, go to the best college, make sure you do a lot of sports. There's nothing wrong with these things, but they don't make us who we are. They can be an extension or an application of our human creativity, an extension or application of our purpose, but they don't define us. When we replace those things with purpose, that's where we go astray. And then when you read, Pew Research does a lot of kind of research reports around this stuff. I think the latest one I read, and I'll probably come back to this later, is that 75% of Americans who were surveyed reported that they do not like their jobs. And I think, well, I get why, because we're chasing the wrong things. We're chasing the number of letters that are after our name and how fancy our business cards are and how many dollars are left over in our bank account at the end of the month. All these things are not necessarily bad, but when they define us, when they become our purpose, then we forget why we're here. And then it becomes easy to fall into the trappings of, well, what about the people who can't do that? What about the people who can't do that? And note, this is a verse that I think is really important when I think, and with the theologians that I research with and write with, we talk a lot about the call to work and the importance of work as what we are here to do in God's created order, okay, to the extent that we are capable. But purpose comes before work. Purpose defines us. Purpose is who we are, and it's given to us. It's bestowed upon us, which means it can't be taken away because a government decides we're not worthy or because society decides we're too expensive, and so we should be discarded, okay? And this is the verse. And note, this comes before the fall, Genesis 2:15. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to care for it. Those are two separate phrases in the original translation, to work it and to care for it. And I think the separation of those phrases is really important, and here's why. To care for something means you're making sure it's not destroyed, right? So if you ever, when you were younger, babysat, or, you watched the neighbor's cat to earn extra money when they were out of town, or you watered somebody's plants, you were taking care of. Right? If you're babysitting, you might not be teaching them French, right? You might just be making sure the kid gets the dinner and then goes to bed on time. You're taking care of. That is part of our responsibility to God's creation. We're to take care of it, meaning don't plunder it, don't destroy it. We're part of God's created order, but that's not all we're asked to do. So note, it's important, and this is part of the creation mandate, we're not put in this beautiful garden, right, and told, watch every blade of grass, watch every tree, and make sure nothing ever gets touched. Make sure nothing ever gets moved around. That's not what we're to do. So we're to cultivate without destroying. So change is part of what we're supposed to do. We're agents of change in that way. Okay, and that's part of who God designed us to be. So note the other part here, to work it. So the original Hebrew is the word abad, which literally translated means to serve. I think that's a really important word that I'm going to kind of thread through this whole talk. What does it mean to serve? To serve the creation, to serve each other. That's part of our responsibility. So you note these things go together, to take care of it, but also to change it, to serve it, to make it better. So one of the theologian friends that I work with says, God's created garden was perfect, but not finished. And I think that's an interesting and good way to think about it. It was perfect because he did it, but it wasn't done. And so we're here to the extent that we can, make some contributions to that. And there's going to be bigger societal ramifications to us who are able to live into that, to do that. Because it's the way, I'm going to, again, make a claim here that I'm going to come back to. This is the way that we serve. And most importantly, it's the way we serve others who can't serve themselves. And as Chip mentioned, that's all of us. We're all broken. We're all broken in different ways. But there's an important aspect of human anthropology that I think is, the start of good economics, which is that we need each other. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. We need each other. We're designed for community. We're not designed to live on an island by ourselves. So this is really an important verse, and it comes before the fall. Why is that important? I think it's important because it helps us understand God's original intentions and his desires for us. That we would live in this communion with him, but we would be working. We would be building communities. We would be building neighborhoods. We would be extending through the earth. That was his desire. And then what happens? I think we have to spend a lot of time thinking about the fall and how it distorts each of us. And I think the important narrative here, and I could have, of course, quoted much more, there's much more to the description of the consequences of the fall. But I think the most important consequence of the fall is the brokenness. So it breaks our relationship with the created order in a couple of ways. It breaks our relationship with God, it breaks our relationship with each other, and it breaks our relationship with the earth. So the brokenness extends to the entire kind of nature of humanity. And so I think it's important to read these verses and not just look at it and say, it's going to be physically hard to do things. Yes, it is going to be physically hard to do things. But it's not necessarily the case that before the fall, work wouldn't have been something we dedicated many, many hours of our time to. But it would not have been filled with frustration. And you can think of the sweat of your brow, right? And the many, many times you have to try something and learn and learn and learn and relearn. It would have been easier, but we always were created to do that. And so the fall breaks this, and it's not just, I think when we think of the fall, we go right to sin, right? And we say, well, there's going to be a lot of people, all of us, who are going to do bad things. And so we need a way to constrain that. In a variety of ways, right? We need the biblical ethics that are the grounding of a free society, I would say, but we also need sanctification and discipleship and all of these things. So we tend to put sin in that bucket, or we tend to put the fall and sin in this little bucket that seems nice and neat to us. But I think it was really important what Chip said earlier, which is part of the fall is the brokenness that we all experience and that plagues us in different ways, which is a limiting of capacities, a limiting of the ability to work in a way that others can. So this affects all of us, but it affects us in different ways. So that means we have a lot of problems on our hands. We have a lot of problems to solve, and as we're promised, the solving of the problem is going to be difficult. I always like to say, and I think it's really important, I'm going to get to this in a second, to reread the language of Genesis and think about the picture that comes to your mind when you're reading the story of what God did on each day. And when you close your eyes and you think about that, I mean, I'm looking outside and I see it, right? It's right there, it's beautiful. And you think, this is the way it is supposed to be. But what do you see out there? You see abundance. The language of Genesis is language of abundance. It is not language of poverty, of frustration, of destitution, of exploitation. And you think of the job that Adam had, go around and name all the animals. And that would have taken a very long time, right? And you think of the language, and there's plenty. There's a lot. There's, in fact, more than one would need at any given time. And so that gets us, why? Why would that be the case? Because we're there to cultivate it, right? We're there to cultivate it, to work it, to manipulate it, to do things, to innovate. And in that innovation, we are here fulfilling God's purposes, okay? So the fall distorts every aspect of this. But I think it's important to go back to the language of Genesis because it, again, that abundance, if you just look out that window right there, you see what was supposed to be and what we were given to work with. And I think that's an important reflection of what restoration will look like as well. And we can maybe talk more about that later. So, when I talk about this as a Christian economist, and the word human flourishing, economists are using a lot more today. You'll hear that word or that phrase being batted around. And I'm all for it. I think it's a great thing. But I think biblical human flourishing is certainly different than what, a secular mainstream anybody philosopher, economist, anybody would say is human flourishing. Because we tend to, again, truncate the definition to just say, well, it's wealth or it's prosperity. And what does prosperity even mean after all, right? We have a lot of different ideas, but I think when we go to the buckets with these definitions, we think, oh, it's when we have a lot of money. And Jonathan Pennington is a theologian who I think has written a really important paper on this. And it's kind of his biblical understanding of human flourishing. And the way he starts this research is to say, human flourishing is the universal search of every human being and of everything we do. Whether it's directed towards biblical flourishing is different, but anytime people do things, that's what religions promise us. Every religion promises us some version of human flourishing. His, of course, project is about the Bible is the way that we get the true definition and understanding of what human flourishing is. But this is just an aspect of what he talks about. And I think this is important because this is the bridge from what is the biblical foundation of the call, purpose, work, and the call to creativity, and kind of understanding what that means in terms of, again, how we live today. What are we here for? How does this matter in the 21st century? And so I just take you to this quote. So he's defining what human flourishing means. Human health, wholeness, resulting in strength, fertility, and longevity. The vision of shalom is at the core of God's redeeming work. And when we talk about shalom, somebody tell me what the translation for that is. What word do you tend to use? We tend to use peace, right? Shalom means peace. And peace is a good thing. Peace is the absence of conflict. But Pennington suggests that that is a narrow and insufficient definition or understanding of what shalom is. Shalom is the way it was supposed to be. So shalom is what you see when you read Genesis. Shalom. And so reweaving shalom is the core of what we as human beings are here to do. Now, we can't obtain perfect shalom on our own because of the fall, because of sin, because of error, because of greed, because of all those things. But our purpose is to reweave shalom. So something that's really important in light of what Chip just talked with us about is that means that every human being on the planet has a purpose and part to play in reweaving shalom. And it is our responsibility to support every human being in that venture. That's a very different narrative than what you might hear culturally today, because it means that everybody has a stake in this. And a life like Rebecca's has purpose, and we might not know what that is right now, but God does. And so we have an obligation to her to have her live in a world that is reweaving shalom. And, by the way, she's also reweaving shalom. But we can't see it. We don't know how. I think that's a really humbling idea, right? Because we like to just talk about what we can see, what we can observe. And I think there's a lot of things that we can't see and observe, and that's where God's at work and asks us to be faithful and trust him. So again, if these things are true, which maybe we might in this room agree that it's true. I think a lot of people don't agree that this stuff is true. So I think the church has a lot of work to do to stand up for these ideas. But one thing that I would say is, before I leave this slide, is that if you look at the words that are up there, strength, fertility, longevity, material well-being is an aspect of biblical human flourishing. Material well-being is a biblical aspect of human flourishing. Because think about just longevity, and I'm going to give you some data on this later. It's very hard to live a long life, and it's especially hard to live a long, productive life. And by productive, what I mean is, being able to have shelter and food. That requires resources, right? So the longer that we can live, we can make an argument as believers that that's important to extend our longevity, because it's more time to be here to reweave shalom in our own unique ways that we're going to each do that. So longevity is important. And if you think about the average human lifespan and how that's changed over time, in 1900, the average lifespan in the United States was about 49 years old. Today, it's pushing 80. There's a debate amongst economists in the literature as to whether we can push this on forever. We won't talk about that today. Probably not. right? But the idea is that we seem to keep adding a year on to the average lifespan every 4 years. It's remarkable. And it's very new in human history that we've been able to do that. And I would say that's a good thing. Because again, go back to God's designs and desires in Genesis. We weren't supposed to die. And we certainly we're not supposed to die early in a suffering way. And so longevity and the things that requires, part of that is material well-being. So I think that's an important thing, because sometimes in Christian circles that gets people not necessarily agreeing with that. Here's another thing that I want to talk about. I think, of course, Scripture does not contradict itself in any way, and there's many examples that we might be able to use here, but I like Jeremiah 29:7. Seek the peace and the prosperity to the city of the city to which I have carried you, for if it prospers, you prosper. It's a really important verse, and I think it's important to remember the context that this is written in. This is written to people who have been exiled, right? Exiled, strangers in a strange land. And the letter goes on to say, not only seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I have carried you, I've put you there, strangers in that strange land, but make sure it's prosperous. Because if it prospers, you prosper. I think this is really important in terms of the current rhetoric around kind of wealth and prosperity. This verse matters a lot because biblical prosperity is one that's mutual. The city only prospers if its people are prospering, and its people prosper when the city prospers. It's mutual. It's not an exploitative story, which is that there's a few people, the 1%ers, or they're at the top of the income distribution or whatever, and they have all the money and they can exploit us. That's a bad thing, and by the way, it does exist. In some places, of course, on the planet more than others. But biblical prosperity is one that is inclusive, not exploitative. Right? And so what does it take for a city to prosper? If you read the letter further, it says, make sure your daughters get married. The idea is that there's community building, and you're going to continue on the mandate that you saw in Genesis. Be fruitful and multiply. Do that even though you're exiled. Do that even though it's hard. Do that even though you feel oppressed. So biblical prosperity, I think, is an important topic. It's a topic we don't talk about enough, in my opinion. But I think it is a different thing than just, God wants you to be Bill Gates, so go out and make sure that happens. And, you're not going to be happy if you don't have that many dollars in your bank account. That's not the message. Now, God may call some people to that kind of wealth. And I think there's a lot of obligations that brings. But the idea here is that prosperity, which includes monetary wealth and well-being and income, doesn't have to be a story of exploitation. And in fact, if it's biblically rooted, it's not one. It's a story of people making contributions to the public good, to the common good, if you will. And so these are important passages. And so from this, I think we can say the Bible has a lot to say about God's created order, who we are as part of that, and the damage that the fall does to what we're supposed to do and who we are, and even how we understand that. I think what was very moving about your story is that even as a parent who's been there the whole time, a lack of understanding about what this means and how do I deal with it and what role do I play. I mean, that requires a lot of trust and faithfulness. But you can't get there from a Darwinian point of view. You cannot. You cannot. You can only get there from a human dignity point of view that's rooted in God's creation story. That's the only way you get there. And so, what I want to say, what I kind of want to bridge to is I think good economics, Milton Friedman always, he said there's good economics and bad economics. Okay, fair enough. I want to talk about good economics. And what I think is the start of good economics is an understanding of human anthropology. And again, as a Darwinian, I don't think you get a real story of human anthropology. You make it up. It's a very utilitarian way of thinking about the world, which is that I'm going to adopt certain principles because we live best when we adopt these principles, but human dignity is kind of on shaky ground, as are other things that we see in Scripture, like property rights, like stewardship, like thrift and prudence and having a long-run view of our place in the world. All those things are biblical. I'm not sure they fall out of other narratives. And so I think good economics, which is always and everywhere just about humans making choices under conditions of scarcity, has to start the story with, well, okay, what's universally true about human beings? And so as you can see, the first thing is we're unique, we're distinct. And this comes from being made in the image of God. There's never been another you to walk the planet, and there never will be. So we bear a lot of traits, a lot of physiology in common, but there's only one you. And that's perfect. That's the way it's supposed to be. And why? What you might say, what does this have to do with economics? Well, actually, it has everything to do with economics, because it's the basis for engaging in trade, which I'll get to in a minute. If we were all exactly the same, there would be no trade. And there's real consequences to a world where we can't benefit from each other's giftedness and skills and talents and ideas. And so we kind of see already, because we're unique, because we're distinct, that has implications for the social order, the political order, the economic order. Okay, but this again comes out of God's infinite understanding of what he wanted when he created us. There's another idea, and this kind of more facilitates itself or manifests itself when we think about economic exchange that people engage in. And so this kind of comes from the Austrian Revolution in economics, which happens at the latter half of the 19th century with Karl Menger and then Ludwig von Mises. And it's this idea that we as human beings assign value to things, and we value those things differently. Right? So just think about, kind of when you go to the store, just think about something kind of simple. When you go to the store and you buy, I always like to talk about grocery stores. You go to the grocery store and there's, wall-to-wall cereal up and down an aisle. And there's all sorts of breakfast items, right? What motivates you to buy one over the other? Well, there's a lot of people who study this and try to figure it out. It turns out it's really hard to predict in the long run. It's hard for us to predict, right? Because the very same people, like when I go to the grocery store and I buy things and then I put them in the pantry, and then a week later I stand in front of the pantry and I say, I don't really want anything here, right? So last Tuesday I couldn't even predict my own desires for next Wednesday. So there's something that's very nuanced and not algorithmic about our choices. So it's the subjective nature of our desires that's part of who we are, but it's also part of our experiences. Maybe you had a bad experience with Fruity Pebbles when you were a kid, and so you don't choose that anymore, right? So it's part experience and ideas and learning that we have, but it's also just part kind of hardwiring, right? You don't like olives, somebody else does, and we can have debates about the goodness of olives, but the point here is that this is important. It sounds like, okay, none of this is rocket science. Why is it important? And I'm going to get to that in a little bit. It's important because the major central planning experiments of the 20th century that are responsible for the deaths of hundreds of millions of people were based on the notion that we could wind people up, that they weren't diverse, that they weren't unique, and that we could plan for them. And this is actually, this kind of little tidbit, this little nugget here reveals to us that that's impossible. It may not be impossible, but it's very hard to do it well. And there's a lot of consequences that come when we try to do that. So this becomes very important when we talk about economic exchange. And then we are profit seekers. This also makes people really uncomfortable because they might say like, well, the greedy Wall Street guys, they're profit seekers, but I'm not. Right, I give a lot to charity or whatever. And I'm making an argument here that this is built into who we are. Again, seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I have carried you. The commandment is to have leftovers. Prosperity means you have leftovers. It means you're not running out all the time. You have leftovers. Okay? I want you to translate in your head. There's mathematical equations that we do to calculate profit. Don't worry, we're not doing that here. But what I want you to understand, I think the colloquial translation is profits are leftovers. When you go out to lunch, you get that to-go box, right? Now you have lunch and dinner. It's exciting, right? We like leftovers. There's a residual. And the residual allows us to allocate more resources in the future. So we tend to think about profits in monetary terms, like how much did this firm make, or how much income does my family have left over at the end of the year after we pay all our bills and do all that stuff. But I think the most precious asset that we have, for which we want and strive daily for leftovers, is our time. Right? I always say time is the great equalizer. It makes Bill Gates and me very much the same. He has 24 hours in a day. I have 24 hours in a day, right? He doesn't know how many days he has, and neither do I. But the goal, again, this universal pursuit towards human flourishing that Pennington talks about, is this idea that we want to maximize, we want to have lots of leftovers in terms of our time. Why would we think that? Because it's good to be here. Why is it good to be here? Because God put us here. So this all keeps coming back together if you have the biblical foundation for thinking about these things. So we are profit seekers. Now, that also, I just painted a really positive spin on all that, right? This has an ugly underbelly as well, which we're going to talk about, and it goes back to the fall and some of the problems that we have to wrestle with. Now, Adam Smith, I'm an economist, so we get fined if we don't put a picture of him in a presentation. So here he is, Adam Smith. Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. So I like Adam Smith, and I think he had some important insights. But he was a moral philosopher. We didn't even use the word economics when he was writing. His first book, I think, is really important. It doesn't get talked about as much, called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And he's really worried about living in Scotland during, the Enlightenment, and he's at the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. And he's really seeing things change, not just for the wealthy, because that's how progress was before. Wealthy people could get a little bit wealthier, but everybody else was kind of destined to kind of live in the situation in which they were born, and there was no real hope of escaping that. So Adam Smith is living at a time that we look back and we say, wow, good thing he wrote those books, because he kind of saw the writing on the wall. But in his first book, he worries about our souls, as he should, as we should. He says, gosh, we're getting wealthier and we're having a lot of stuff, and having the stuff is nice, but are we ever going to be, he used the word tranquility a lot. We don't use that word. I think we should go back to it. Are we tranquil? Are we at peace with ourselves? And he was worried that living in this commercial society was going to maybe destroy that. And then he writes another book, which he's very famous for, called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which he publishes in 1776. That was a big year, right, for humans. So this book, he's looking at the world and he's saying, some nations are rich, some nations are poor. Why? So he kind of changes his tune on wealth. He's still worried about what it can do to us morally. But he sees the benefit of it and then understands, well, why are people unequal in their ability to obtain this? And so he spends a lot of time in that book thinking about this kind of idea of living amongst strangers, which is the way demographically and sociologically the world is changing. So we've moved out of just agrarian subsistence living to some extent, not everyone, of course, at this time. But you're seeing people leave that life and go into the cities and live amongst each other. And there's a culture that builds. There's different dynamics. We're now interacting with strangers. You have to think about what life is like on the farm in 1700. You don't meet that many people that you don't already know, and you mostly interact with your family. And unless you're wealthy, you farm to eat. Most people are not engaged in any aspect of global commerce at this time. Right? So he says this, and as he's wrestling with all of this, he's like, okay, here's my question. We are all self-interested. This is an important aspect, in fact, I would say, of a biblical understanding of our human anthropology. We are self-interested. What does that mean? That's at the heart of our choices, meaning we make decisions on what our perception, our own perception of what's going to make us better in the moment. Right? So that's how we choose. But he saw the problems associated with this, that this easily turns into unmitigated self-love. This is a word he used a lot, the phrase, and greed. So he was worried about this. How do all these self-interested people who just do what they want, they're profit seekers, that's part of who they are, they want to do what's best for themselves, how do they live amongst each other without beating each other over the head all the time? It was a real question, right? And his insight was, if the incentives are right, and if the institutions in a society are right, then people will focus outward and be other-looking, and not just be inward-looking. What can I maximize for myself in the moment? And so he said we can take this self-love and facilitate it into considerations for the common good. Now, he was very careful as I wrote about this. He wasn't saying market economies are going to make us benevolent altruists. That's not what he was saying, and that's really important about his work. He said we have to take people as they are and design a society, design a set of institutions in which they take that desire to please self and think about and incorporate the needs and desires of others. How do we do that? Right? We think about when he was writing too, and it seems very profound to me, but you think about it today, and I think we still have the same questions. Because there are people today that wake up in the world and they don't know how they're going to get all their meals today. And they don't know if they're going to die of malaria. And they don't know how long they're going to live. And they don't know if their government is going to exploit them. They're going to get caught up into a human trafficking ring. These are real problems in the world today. So I think there's real reasons, and I'm going to talk about this, real reasons to be optimistic about the trends, historical trends, but I think real concerns that need to be solved. And I think to solve them, we have to be rooted in the foundation, which is what we've kind of been talking about here so far tonight. And I think, I put this Philippians verse up here because I think it's important to note that it's not... Scripture recognizes that we are to care for our own interests as well. You think about flying on an airplane, and what do they tell you in the safety demonstration? Put the thing, the oxygen mask on your face first, not because, you're the best or you're the most important, because if you're most able and you can do this and put it on yourself, then you're able to help more people. Right? So again, it's thinking about a society where the stronger can help those who aren't as strong, where the included can help the excluded. What type of social, economic, political order rests on that foundation? And that's, I think, the conversation that's really on the forefront, at least as I see it in American politics today, and something we need to recapture as the church and as Christians. All right, so I want to kind of get into a little bit more of the technical aspects of economics, and then get to kind of some of the bigger social ideas here. So Ludwig von Mises is an important economist. He's in a school called the Austrian School of Economics, just because this was a group of people writing at the beginning of the 20th century, and they were from Austria. And he says, people engage in economic exchange. He called it the model of human action. And the model of human action suggests that when people are propelled into choices, when they're making a decision, and that is the necessary first step of economic exchange. Three things have to be true. They have to experience a state of uneasiness, so they're unhappy with their current state of affairs. And then they have a vision for a different outcome. If I do something, I'm going to relieve the uneasiness, right? And then they take conscious and purposeful steps to be here, to get there. It doesn't mean they're right. It doesn't mean they're not greedy. It means that when people are engaging in economic exchange, these are the assumptions that we're making about those people. And this is really important because it allows us a narrative to understand behaviors across all types of people. You put a picture of Hitler up before. When I'm talking to my students in the classroom, I say this: Hitler behaved in this way, right? So the model of human action applies whether we think the ends are vile, right, and atrocious, or whether they're good and, promote human flourishing. And so it's a really important narrative. And it also presumes that people that are engaged in these economic choices have purpose. They're not wind-up toys. You can't program human beings. And this is very unsettling news if you're a dictator, because dictatorship not only desires this of human beings, but when it realizes that this cannot happen, then what happens? Gas chambers, the gulag, right? So it's the spirit of humanity, I think, that drives economic exchange. So this is the model of human action, and this really changes economics as a discipline, because it puts the emphasis on human beings and why they make the choices that they do, and what constrains those choices, or what, furthers those choices. So kind of to put it shortly, the economic way of thinking, which is how I like to talk about it, is we're profit seekers That's part of our anthropology, who attempt to maximize value, our own value, under conditions of radical uncertainty. So another kind of important insight of economics is that we don't know what to do most of the time. We face a lot of uncertainty in our choices. And so we need a system that alleviates some of that uncertainty. And I'm going to get to that. I know, Chip, in your own work, you talk about resource allocation, and I think that is the core of economics. So the core of economics is that we live in a world of scarcity, and those scarce resources have multiple and competing ends. So think about the loggers that wake up in the morning in a place like South Carolina. They go and chop down the trees. Those trees have many, many uses in terms of consumer products. Research suggests one tree can be 5,000 different consumer products, which is a lot. But you have to choose. The tree that goes to make the table can't also make printer paper. You have to choose. That's scarcity. So the goal, again, think about kind of biblical human flourishing. The goal isn't just make sure we don't run out of trees. The goal is make sure we don't run out of trees and that we find all the valuable uses of those trees. And so you need a system of incentives that aligns those two things together. And one of those things is property rights, which we also can trace very clearly back to biblical principles. Most importantly, I would say you see this in the Ten Commandments, right? And I always like to say this in terms of economic realities. Economic realities are just like the realities of physics, right? If I go to the top of this building and I walk off the side, bad things are going to happen to me because of gravity. I don't have to know it. I don't have to have a PhD in physics. I don't have to understand it very well other than don't do that, because it's a real constraint on my behavior. Economics imposes the same realities on us. One of those realities is scarcity. We can't wave a policy wand and make scarcity go away. We're never promised that we can do that. So I don't think that's even the right question. The right question, again, is how do you see that trees are valuable for human beings and their well-being? And so you have the idea is how do we innovate around trees, but also make sure they don't run out, right? So it's a kind of thing that sounds contradictory. The other economic reality, this goes back to our anthropology about being distinct, is we have what economists call comparative advantage. We have a comparative advantage. We tend to talk about this nation to nation, but it doesn't start there. It ends there. It starts with us as people, right? So we may be relatively low cost at doing some things and high cost at most others. And so what do people do when they go to college or graduate school or they're in an apprenticeship program? What are they trying to do? They're trying to do what Adam Smith talked about, specialization. We try to craft, hone, specialize, be better to the extent that we can at what God created us to do. And again, why would we do this? And I want to talk about how this works well or best, I think, in a market economy. And the idea is because we can start to think about serving other people. And that's the whole point. So another economic reality is that we respond to incentives. We have reasons that we do things and reasons that we don't do things. This is what tort law is about, right? Tort law is about having rules, penalties for behavior that we deem as bad. And what is that for? It's because we can't just rely on people adhering to the rules, even though most will. Even in a free society with the moral foundation like the one we live in, still has people who are sinful and greedy and non-believers, right? So a system of law is a system of incentives that helps us to, again, live amongst each other. Now, anybody know what this is a picture of, what store this is? Is Walmart. I love to use this as an example because, this is a very successful billionaire family who, I read part of Sam Walton's biography. He had this crazy idea that big box stores would do well in rural communities, and nobody believed him. Because it was all mom and pop stores. You had the mom and pop grocery store, the mom and pop hardware store, all this stuff. You knew your neighbors, blah, blah, blah. And he said, no, this giant store that has all that stuff in one place is going to do well in rural Arkansas. And he bought a franchise for another retail store, and he tried to convince the management to do it, and they kept saying no. So he's like, I'll just go out on my own. And then you have Walmart. So I think what's important about the incentive story here is that, I go to Walmart all the time and I never really interact with the same person twice. I have never seen the same cashier twice. I don't know the manager, and I certainly don't know the Walton family. And if you look at Walmart's mission statement, you know what it is? Save money, live better. I like that. Leftovers, right? It's a good thing. But why do the billionaire CEOs of Walmart care about whether ordinary people like you and me don't pay too much for our shampoo? Are they benevolent altruists who have somehow, that's not the story. Doesn't mean that CEOs can't be benevolent and they can't be altruistic. The point here, and it's the insight of Adam Smith, which is tied back to our understanding of our anthropology, right, that we're good but fallen, is that he lives in a society that establishes a set of market incentives which says this: hey, you might be able to make it really rich if you find a way to bring people cheap cereal and cheap shampoo. So your goal in life is to make sure people save as much money as possible. And you can imagine that that does well in rural communities. He was onto something, right? But see what Adam Smith talked about. It's an outward focus. It's an outward focus, not just an inward focus. Yeah, I could want to be rich, and CEOs on Wall Street or anywhere else can be greedy. A market economy doesn't rely on them to be superhuman. It takes people as they are and says, how do we make a potential greedy, exploitative person on their worst day think about how I serve others? And what I think is important about that is, how do we think about serving ordinary people? It's not just the rich serving the rich, because frankly, I don't think Bill Gates cares how much his shampoo costs. I suggest to you, he might not even know. Somebody probably buys that for him. So who cares if it's $3 more? Nobody. Or he doesn't, but the single mother who lives in Baltimore in the inner city, she cares. And we want to provide opportunities for her to have these costs alleviated, these hard trade-offs that she faces. So, we have to kind of have a society that thinks about those incentives. I'm going to skip some of this because I want to stop in time for questions. I think this, I don't know if anybody recognizes this, but this is the story, this is a movie called Castaway, and it's a great story, or a great lesson in economics. I don't know if you remember it. It's kind of old at this point, but it's Tom Hanks. He does a really good job in this movie, and it's the story of, he's a FedEx executive. It's Christmas Eve. He proposes to his girlfriend. Life is wonderful. He gets on a cargo plane. He's the only other person beside the pilots, and he crashes. And he's on a desert island, and the rest of the movie is him trying to figure out how to get off the island. But he has real important human needs. He has to eat every day. He has to get clean, drinkable water every day. He has to have shelter from the elements every day. But what's his biggest concern? Get me out of here. But the thing is, if he can't do the 3 basic things every day, he's never going to get out of here. And it's a real story about the truth of our anthropology, which is that we were not meant to do anything alone. We need each other. He would be much better off, right, if he had like one of those long lighters and some, kindling wood and, some frozen stuff from Costco. That would have made it more like a camping trip. Instead, it's survival, and you don't know how it's going to go for him. And this is any one of us in that situation. Doesn't matter how smart you are. It doesn't matter how rich you are. It doesn't matter how many times you've been the president. None of that matters on the island, because you weren't meant to be on the island. That's the story. So again, the implications here are that we need a society where we can rely on each other. Again, I have too many stories to tell, so I'm going to skip some of this. But this, I think, is exciting. Again, I'm an economist, so I have to have a graph, I'm sorry. But it's a good graph. So this is just, kind of the way economists measure affluence. We look at something called income. This is world GDP from AD 1, a long time ago. We didn't have a census bureau, so these are back-of-the-envelope calculations that many economists do, to now. And I think what's important about this graph is that for most of humans, over most of human history, we've lived on about $100 a year. The high estimates are $400 a year. And we died very early. And we didn't have this world of Walmarts, of laptop computers, of life-saving medical advancements that give us the chance to do what God has put us here to do, which is mysterious to all of us. We don't know. Right? So the story here is an optimistic one. That has changed radically. We call this the hockey stick graph, because literally it's a flat line and then boom, it goes up. And I think I want you to understand that this is not just about money. Again, it's about transforming a society so that people can't become like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or, Jeff Bezos or whoever the people that you think of in your mind here. They can't do that on net unless they're thinking about service. Now, it doesn't mean that all consumer preferences, by the way, should be satisfied, so we can have that conversation later. But we're not looking for perfect. There's no perfect economic or political system. We're looking for what system takes fallen human beings as they are and induces them to think about ways to serve strangers. So I'm going to end with a story. I'm going to skip all the other graphs. Aren't you excited? I have a lot of graphs. Okay, so this is Boris Yeltsin. It's one of my favorite stories. Boris Yeltsin, as you may know, was the former leader of Russia after the failure of the Soviet Union and the ousting of Mikhail Gorbachev. This picture is taken in, I believe, 1991, when Boris Yeltsin was visiting the United States. He was in Houston, Texas, and he was visiting NASA, the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, I presume with then-President George Bush. And he was at the Space Center. This is, the thing diplomats do. And he said, this is all nice and good, but I want to go to a grocery store. And so they took him on an unscheduled trip to a grocery store. You can Google the story. These are pictures from that trip. They went to Randall's grocery store in Houston, Texas on a Tuesday. And this is his look on all the pictures. He's overwhelmed at what he sees in an ordinary American grocery store. He talks about this later in his autobiography. He says this experience in an American grocery store converted him into a reformer to the extent that he was one. And he said he was both overwhelmed and depressed by what he saw. He was overwhelmed at the stuff waiting for customers. He couldn't believe it. It's well lit, it's air conditioned, there's a freezer section. He's in the popsicle aisle, by the way, right there. It's exciting. Why are these housewives pushing the cart around and they're like, not excited? Nobody's jumping up and down. He couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe it. He says, and I always get goosebumps when I think about this, if the Russian people heard of this, surely they'd revolt. That's right. Because it's not necessary to be immiserated. And I'm just talking about kind of basic consumer goods. Popsicles are a total luxury. Right? We don't need them to survive. They're there for us because we have so much. So what about the things that are really saving our lives? And I just like to end this with a little story about how I think that this relates to us personally in a very real way. This is a picture of my daughter who was born, I went into labor at 26 weeks, which is very early, and I was on hospital bed rest for 5 of those 26 weeks, or 5 weeks. And all I could do was basically wait on people to come do a variety of tests, including check my blood pressure, check my temperature. They put monitors on my belly to detect her heart rate. And they did this every 4 hours. And so every 4 hours that we passed those tests was a victory for her. But I could do nothing for her, nothing. And I have to tell you that 5 times, 5 weeks for someone like me with just a window to look out of is a lot of time on your hands to think. And what I thought about was my female counterpart in a place like Bangladesh, and I'm not sure why Bangladesh came to my mind. But I thought, why am I in one of the best hospitals in the world? It was a teaching hospital, so there was everybody in there learning, I'm learning from them. There's all sorts of people in there all the time. At my disposal to try to do anything they could to make sure she made it. She had the best chance possible. My female counterpart in Bangladesh does not have that same story. Why? I'm not better than her. I'm not smarter than her. I'm certainly not, I don't have greater dignity than her. So what's the difference? The difference is I live in a world with lots of economic and political freedom. And so people have put a lot of their creative thinking into figuring out how to save her life. She was born at 31 weeks. And she lived like this for 5 weeks in an incubator. Preemies can't do 3 things that are really important. They can't feed themselves, they can't regulate their body temperature, and they can't regulate their heart rate. Any one of those things will kill you. So all of this stuff is doing it for her. Again, what could I do for her? Not much physically. I can't do much for her in this environment. I felt very helpless. But I look at all the things that are around her that people have innovated and developed and tinkered with and discovered. And there's a whole story of hundreds of thousands of hands that have touched these products that saved her life. She turned 5 yesterday. That's great, right? That's a great story. But that story can be extended to as many people as possible, to the vulnerable, to the excluded. Regardless of capacity, regardless of what they think they could be or not. And I have to tell you, and I'm going to stop here, this is the patent application. Did you see that thing on her nose? See that little tiny loop? So she can't feed herself, so she has it's called an infant nasal feeding tube, and it's taped to her cheek, and it's pumping donated breast milk into her stomach. The patent application was filed by a man, a doctor named Henry Turkle, in 1951. And you know what I find humbling and interesting about this is that in 1951, the infant nasal feeding tube was not used on premature babies because premature babies didn't survive in 1951. He was working with Down syndrome babies who have sucking reflex problems, and he innovated this as a way to get them fed at a very low-cost way. So, 70 years later, he saves my daughter's life. He's a part of that story. And I think that's what we want to extend. And again, we're not extending it just to the rich and the powerful and the Boris Yeltsins of the world. We're extending it to ordinary people, and we're giving as many people as possible a chance to experience, to bathe in the reweaving of shalom. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.